All right, Ninja Nerds, in this video we're going to talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, we've already talked about the intro to the autonomic nervous system and we talked about the sympathetic nervous system in detail. If you haven't already watched those videos, please go watch those videos. All right? Now, we're not going to go into extreme detail on each one of these cranial nerves, and the reason being is that we've already covered most of the actual cranial nerves in great detail in those individual nerve videos. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the cranial outflow, because if you remember, we said that the parasympathetic nervous system, all right, the parasympathetic nervous system is primarily going to be what's called craniosacral outflow, okay? And what do we mean by that? So we said that the parasympathetic nervous system came from specific cranial nerves. For example, we have what's called cranial nerve 3, right? We have another one, cranial nerve, what? 7. We have another one, which is going to be cranial nerve 9. And then we have another one, which is going to be cranial nerve 10. And then their actual names, oculomotor, and then we're going to have facial, glossopharyngeal, and then we're going to have vagus, right? So these are the cranial nerves. These are the ones that have parasympathetic fibers associated with them. The other part of the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be the sacral division of the spinal cord. So if you remember, that was from S2 to S4. So the other part is going to be the sacral part of the spinal cord. So specifically, we said that this was going to be from S2 to S4. So we call this collectively, together, as one big group, we say that this is the craniosacral outflow or output, okay? So that is what we're going to focus on. So in this video, we're going to talk about the third cranial nerve, its effects, 7th, 9th, 10th, same thing, their effects. Then we're going to talk about the fibers of the sacral part of the spinal cord and what organs they innervate, and again, their overall function. Before we do that, though, we have to know, because we talked about this in the sympathetic nervous system, these guys don't kind of work on their own. We have to have some type of structure that controls their activity. So if you know, there's a specific structure right here, and it's called the hypothalamus, right? And the hypothalamus is actually connected to a structure called the pituitary gland through what's called the infundibulum. But what's important to know is that the hypothalamus does have portions that are actually going to be specifically parasympathetic. So they do affect the parasympathetic nervous system. Let's just say, for this sake, we draw this portion here as though this is the parasympathetic portion of the hypothalamus. So that's our parasympathetic portion. What can happen is this can give presynaptic fibers that can descend downwards. And guess what it can do? It can give stimulation to this nucleus. It can give stimulation to this nucleus, this one, and this one to stimulate the actual cranial outflow. So now let's assume that we stimulated this nerve nucleus right here. Okay, so the third cranial nerve, we already know that this is going to be 3. It has a specific nucleus that's associated with the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve, if you remember, has parasympathetic fibers, and it also has somatomotor fibers. We talked about that. But the specific nucleus here for 3, if you remember, it's called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus, what happens is it takes parasympathetic fibers outwards, right? And then as it takes these parasympathetic fibers outwards, and if you remember, parasympathetic fibers, they're preganglionic. Do you remember if they were long or short? They're long. So you have long preganglionic parasympathetic motor neurons. And eventually what happens is they go to a ganglia. Okay, what's a ganglia? A ganglia, by definition, is a group of cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system. What is this ganglia that the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, the axons of it, go to? It's specifically called the ciliary ganglion. Okay? So the Edinger-Westphal nucleus has axons that come out as the preganglionic, long parasympathetic motor neurons. They come to a ganglion, synapse on the ciliary ganglion to be specific. Then what happens? Oh, what's another? Remember we said that these ganglia for parasympathetic, they're very specific. What type of ganglia do we call these? When you have long preganglionic, which pretty much go to the target organ or even go into the target organ. We call those intramural or terminal ganglia. So we're going to say here that this is an example of intramural ganglia. Okay? So that's important to remember, because the sympathetic was the one that had the prevertebral or the paravertebral. And it did have that one exception, which went to the adrenal medulla via the intramural ganglia. Okay? But now, parasympathetic, it's pretty much all intramural or terminal ganglia. Okay? Intramural or terminal, and that specific type is the ciliary. From that, ganglion. Parasympathetic postganglionic fibers will come out, and what happens is they'll pierce through the sclera and then move into like this perichoroidal space. And what happens is it'll actually give fibers to two different destinations. One is actually going to be the ciliaris muscle. The other one is going to be the pupil. Now, if you remember, we said that the ciliaris muscle, which is the first destination, what happens to this guy? So first thing it's going to do is it's going to innervate the ciliaris. What's going to happen to the ciliaris? It's going to contract. Now, when the ciliaris contracts, the zonials actually become relaxed. Okay, so whenever the ciliaris contracts, the zonials, the suspensory ligaments, which are basically connecting to the lens here, that becomes very, very lax. So the ciliary zonials are going to become relaxed. When the zonials relax, what happens in this situation is it allows for this actual lens to become more globular-like. Okay? So now the lens is going to become more globular-like. When the zonials relax and the lens becomes globular, what is the significance of this? The whole significance of this effect right here is to help with what's specifically called near vision. Okay, so it's going to help to undergo what's called accommodation, and that accommodation response is going to help us to see things that are nearby. So this is going to help in the process of near vision. Okay, that's the overall response there. So it's going to undergo an accommodation response where it changes the shape of the lens, makes it more globular, which helps us for near vision. Okay, the other muscle that it goes to is what's called the sphincter pupillae. When it goes to the sphincter pupillae, the muscles of the sphincter pupillae, when it contracts, it acts like a ring, okay, like a sphincter. And when it contracts, it squeezes the pupil hole small, right? So it's trying to squeeze the pupil hole and constrict the pupil hole, making that pupil hole really, really, really small. So by doing that, what's that called? It's going to cause pupil constriction. And if you constrict the pupil, that also has an effect with near vision, but even more specifically, it allows for less light rays to come into the eye, right? Okay, so that's the effect there on the eye. All right, now let's come back over here and let's go to the next one. So the next one here, which is going to be a little bit lower within the pons, kind of around the pons medulla junction, there's a specific nucleus here. This nucleus right here, so we said, what was this one here called? This purple one, just so we remember. I'm not going to write the whole darn thing out because I don't even know how to spell it very well. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus, okay? The next one, though, which is at the lower pons, kind of around the medulla junction area there, this is called the superior salivatory nucleus. And this is going to be for the facial nerve, okay? Superior salivatory nucleus. Now, what happens with this guy is he's going to come out, right? And again, he's going to have long preganglionic axons. And if you remember, going back, it was actually what nerve? It actually became a part of what's called the greater petrosal nerve, if you remember, right? But again, it's actually going to come out, and it's going to go to a ganglia. And what is that ganglia here called? This ganglia, where it actually synapses, it actually has two ganglia to be specific. So let's actually show here. Because if it goes up through the greater petrosal nerve, right, it'll come up and supply the lacrimal gland and also some palatine glands and some nasal glands. But if it goes downward, it actually goes a part of the chorda tympani, which actually is going to go to the tongue, right, specifically for salivation. So there's two ganglia. If it goes as the greater petrosal nerve, it'll come up here. That ganglion right here is specifically called the pterygopalatine ganglion, okay? That's the pterygopalatine ganglia. And then these fibers will come out here and they'll come to specific glandular structures, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what's the other one? The other one, remember, this one is part of the greater petrosal nerve, the one that goes to the pterygopalatine ganglia. But if it actually comes through the actual middle ear, if you remember, there's what's called the posterior canaliculus, anterior canaliculus, and then it moves out with the chorda tympani. Then it goes to the tongue area. This ganglion here is called the submandibular ganglion. Okay? Now, these guys will come out here and it'll go to some specific glands that we're going to talk about. Now, pterygopalatine ganglion. Now remember, if I talked to you about in the sympathetic, the postganglionics release norepinephrine. And then the sympathetic preganglionic neurons released acetylcholine. And the parasympathetic, remember, the preganglionic and the postganglionic motor neurons both release acetylcholine. But you can have different receptors. We'll make a video sometime on that about the different types of muscarinic and nicotinic receptors. So let's say that if it goes pterygopalatine ganglia, what are some of the glands that it's going to go to? It can go to, specifically, it could be the lacrimal glands. It could be the nasal glands. It could even be the palatine glands. Okay, so it can innervate a lot of these glands here, lacrimal, nasal, palatine glands. It's going to release acetylcholine that's going to stimulate these cells to start increasing their production of these watery secretions. For example, lacrimal secretions, nasal secretions, palatine secretions. So it's going to increase the actual secretions here. So you're going to have more of this actual tear production, you're going to have more nasal secretions, and you're going to have more palatine secretions, okay? So that's the effect there via the pterygopalatine ganglia. So now let's say that it comes over here, right, as a part of the chorda tympani. And as it comes a part of the chorda tympani, it gives off fibers, remember, that goes to the submandibular ganglion. Then those postganglionic parasympathetic fibers are going to come over here, and they're going to stimulate specific glandular structures. What type of glandular structures? These ones are going to be like your submandibular and your sublingual salivary glands, right? When it goes to these glands, what's it going to do? It's going to increase the production of saliva. So as you start making more of this saliva, it's going to be making saliva rich in a lot of different types of enzymes. One specific component of the saliva is going to be what's called salivary amylase. We'll talk about this more when we get into the GI, but specifically this is important for being able to break down carbohydrates, specifically polysaccharides. So it's the first site of chemical digestion within the alimentary canal. All right, so now that takes care of that part. Now, we got to go to the next guy. Okay, the next guy over here is this green nucleus. This green nucleus is going to be specifically called the inferior salivatory nucleus, right, within the medulla. Now this guy is the glossopharyngeal nerve, right? The glossopharyngeal nerve is going to give fibers, right? And if you remember, this is the one that goes as the part of the lesser petrosal nerve. And then what happens? It goes to a specific ganglion. And we had a long pathway for this guy, but eventually it gets to a specific ganglion, all right? This ganglion is called the otic ganglion, okay? Now the otic ganglion is really important because from here, this is going to send the remaining amount of fibers, parasympathetic fibers, to the last salivary gland, one of the big ones on the side of your face, right next to the masseter muscle. This guy right here is going to be called the parotid salivary gland. What it's going to do is it's going to stimulate, release acetylcholine, right, onto these actual muscarinic receptors on this specific gland. And let's assume that in this case, this gland is the parotid gland. So the parotid salivary gland. And what is it going to do? It's going to stimulate this guy to start increasing the secretions, right? As it stimulates this guy to increase the salivary secretions, again, what type of substances will it want to have? It'll want to have lots of salivary amylase. And what else? What else is important for being able to digest food? Lots of watery secretions. You want to really moisten that bolus, the food bolus, right? So whenever you're chewing food, you want to have lots of saliva there to mix with the food bolus. So not only is it making things that are rich in salivary amylase, but it's increasing the actual watery secretion. So you want it to be a little bit more of a watery secretion. Okay, same thing over here. You're going to want to not only have salivary amylase here, but increase the watery secretions. You want to really be able to lubricate that food and convert it into a compact mass called a bolus so that we can push it back into the oropharynx area whenever we undergo the deglutition response. Okay, so that covers that guy. Now, for the big mama, the one who does so darn much, this is going to be the dorsal nucleus of vagus. All right, so this is where the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve, if you don't remember any of these, at least remember the vagus nerve. He controls pretty much 90% of the parasympathetic responses. So he controls a lot of different structures. 70% of the afferent neurons that are pretty much within the actual abdominal visceral area is going to be vagus nerve. So he controls so much of the parasympathetic flow. Now, this guy, again, I'm not going to go over every single branch. I'm going to keep it very simple and say it has various plexus, right? So over here, one of them is it's going to go to the lungs, specifically the bronchi, right? Now, in the bronchi, you have smooth muscle, right? And the smooth muscle is responsible for either constricting the actual bronchial or dilating it. Now, we're resting. We're not really worried about being able to get as much ventilation as possible. So what are we going to want to do? Waste our energy on making our bronchioles dilate? No. We're going to want to constrict them. All right, so what's going to happen here is we're going to come to this actual bronchial. So we call this one specifically, we call it the pulmonary plexus. So we call it the pulmonary plexus. And what's the overall effect here on the bronchioles? So the overall effect here on the bronchioles is you're going to have what's called bronchoconstriction. Okay? So you're going to have bronchoconstriction because you're not going to want to really have those airways dilated. You don't want to waste energy on that. But another thing, if you're resting, you're not really worried about mucus production either, right? So, I mean, you don't want to, when you're in a fight or flight situation, you don't want mucus blocking your airways, right? You want to be able to get as much oxygen in. But in a parasympathetic situation, you're not really going to be running away from anybody. You're going to be chilling out, resting. So in that situation, you don't care about the mucus production. You can go ahead and do it if you want to. So there is going to be an increase in secretions, specifically like the mucus secretions. Okay, so there might be some mucus secretions there. Okay, so that's the effect on the lungs, okay, the pulmonary system. What about the heart? There's another plexus here. Another plexus that's actually going to come over here, and it's going to be called the cardiac plexus, okay? Now, you know there was many branches. We already went over all of that in the vagus nerve video. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But we already have a knowing that the cardiac plexus is going to go to the heart. Now, we have to be very careful because parasympathetic nervous system doesn't really affect the myocardium, like the actual contractile cells. It affects the nodal cells. Okay, there is some literature that says that it can affect some of the atrial muscle cells, but not really. It's specifically focusing on the nodal cells. If you remember some of those structures, we said that for the heart, all right, so for the heart, what was the overall effect here? It was affecting the SA node, and what was the other big one? AV node. So it was trying to be able to affect these two guys here. Now, if you remember, we did say right vagus goes to SA node, left vagus goes to the AV node. But what's really important here is what type of effect do they have on these guys? So the overall effect of these guys is it tries to be able to decrease their action potentials. If you decrease the amount of action potentials this SA node and AV node is sending, what's the overall effect? It's going to slow down the heart rate. So it's going to decrease the heart rate. So we say it has negative chronotropic action and dromotropic action and bathmotropic, meaning it can affect various different parts of the conduction system. But we're not going to talk about that. So again, decreases the heart rate. Overall effect of decreasing the heart rate is you can decrease the blood pressure. Okay, so again, that's the overall effect. If it decreases the heart rate, it can lead to a decrease in the blood pressure. All right, sweet deal. So that covers that part. Now, what else? It also gives fibers that can go to the esophagus. Okay, so it also can give fibers here that can go to the esophagus. So look at this bad boy here. If it goes to the esophagus, it's called the esophageal plexus, right? So it can give off branches here that become a part of what's called the esophageal plexus. Now, if you remember, there's a part called deglutition. There's two phases, the oral phase, or they call it the buccal phase, and the pharyngoesophageal phase. What happens is the esophageal plexus is important for causing the peristalsis, the alternating waves of contraction and relaxation within the smooth muscle of the esophagus and the stomach and a lot of the actual GI tract. So for here, it's going to increase the peristalsis. All right, so it's going to increase the motility there of the esophagus. All right, so that covers that. So we have the pulmonary plexus, the cardiac plexus, and the esophageal plexus. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because what happens is the esophageal plexus can actually come over here, and it can continue and give off like a posterior gastric branches, and it can come over here and give off anterior gastric branches to the stomach also to increase the motility of the actual stomach. So here it can affect the stomach, and if it affects the stomach, it's going to increase the motility of the stomach via peristalsis. What else could it do to the stomach? We're going to talk about this in another video, but you have what's called submucosal nerve plexus and a myenteric nerve plexus. It can act on those guys to increase the myenteric to increase the motility, but it can act on the submucosal plexus as well as other cells in this area, such as parietal cells, and it can cause those parietal cells to make more gastric juices, right? So it can actually increase secretions. All right, so it can increase motility, it can increase secretions. Now, here's where it gets a little kind of tricky here. What happens is, from this guy, you're gonna have another structure. So I'm not gonna be too crazy here, but I'm just gonna say that I'll say it simply, you have another structure here. It's mainly from the right vagus, okay? And the right vagus is gonna feed into what's called the celiac plexus, okay? So the celiac plexus. Now the celiac plexus, which is mainly here, I'll put it here on the side, it's mainly coming from the right vagus. What happens is the celiac plexus is gonna supply a whole bunch of different structures. It can give supplies to the kidney. Some people say that it doesn't, but it can give a little bit of effect to the kidney, specifically around the blood vessels there and then also the ureter, okay? It also can give supply to the ascending colon. It can give supply to the transverse colon, but specifically the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. It can give supply to the part of the duodenum and even jejunum and even ileum, right? So it can give supply to a lot of different parts of the colon. So the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the proximal 2/3 of it. It can even give supply to the pancreas, right? So it can even give supply to the pancreas as well. So there's a lot of different structures, and if you want, I'm not gonna take the whole sucker all the way over there, but it can even go to the spleen too, okay? But I'm not gonna take it over there. So you know that if overall, it can go to the kidney, and so with the kidney, it's basically gonna try to be able, specifically, it says that it can actually help to increase some of the contractions of the ureter, and it can also help to play a role within the urine formation, okay? The urine formation part is a little controversial, but they do say that it can help with a little bit in urine formation. And then over here, it's supposed to cause the contractions of the ureter. Okay, so it can cause contractions of the ureter. Okay, over here for the colon and for the jejunum and the ileum and stuff like that, what's the overall effect? Now for the colon, specifically for the colon, so when we talk about the actual large intestine, okay, the large intestine, this one is more specifically on increasing motility. That is its main design, okay, is to increase the motility, all right? But for the small intestine, like the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum, it has a little bit of an effect also on secretions and some absorption. So it can actually increase motility, it can increase secretions, and it can help to increase a little bit of the absorption processes, okay? For the pancreas, it actually can act on specific cells in the pancreas. You know, there was the islet of Langerhans. The islet of Langerhans are actually there, and you have alpha cells and beta cells. Remember, there's specific cells there. They're called pancreatic beta cells. It can act on the pancreatic beta cells, and it can cause insulin to be released. Okay, so it can help to stimulate the release of insulin. It's not a powerful stimulator, but it can definitely cause insulin to be released. Okay, another one, another branch here. Let's actually have this guy come in here. We're going to do this one here. It's going to be, again, a little bit more specific. But this guy here comes from the left vagus, okay? This one here, which I'm trying to make a little bit thicker here, is coming from the left vagus, and that's going to go to the liver, and it's going to go to the gallbladder and some of the biliary tree here, okay? Why is this important? This one here, we need to understand that this right here, I'm actually going to kind of write this one here, we're going to have the hepatic plexus, okay? So this is called the hepatic plexus. The hepatic plexus is the one that's coming mainly from the left vagus nerve. Now, what happens is the hepatic plexus is going to go to the liver. It can help the liver to be able to do a specific process. One of those processes here is it can stimulate what's called glycogenesis. Okay? Because you're resting. You're not really worried about your glucose levels being able to increase. You're actually focusing on kind of storing them. You're resting. You're digesting. Okay? Also, it can act on the gallbladder. Let's say that you just ate, right? You want to be able to break down that Big Mac, all that fat, all that different substances. So what's it going to do? It can actually stimulate gallbladder contractions. So it can stimulate gallbladder contractions. So it's been found to stimulate glycogenesis, stimulate gallbladder contractions, and there's another one here. It's kind of a cool one too. There's a little muscle here called the hepatopancreatic sphincter, right? Or the sphincter of Oddi. And what happens is it does have receptors for acetylcholine. And if this actual fibers come down here and stimulate the sphincter of Oddi, it can actually relax the hepatopancreatic sphincter, or the sphincter of Oddi. However, this is more heavily regulated by a specific type of enteric hormone called cholecystokinin. Okay? Cholecystokinin has more of an effect on the hepatopancreatic sphincter relaxation and gallbladder contraction. Okay? Again, we'll talk about that when we get into the GI. Okay, but so far we know the basic components, the basic branches of the vagus. Just because it's so much, let's have a real quick recap. Ready? Pulmonary plexus goes to the bronchioles, causes bronchoconstriction, increased secretions there. Cardiac plexus causes a effect on the SA node, AV node to decrease the heart rate, which can eventually decrease blood pressure. The esophageal plexus goes to the esophagus and increases the peristaltic activity there. What else? We'll also have the celiac plexus, which specifically comes from the right vagus. That can help to increase urine formation. It can also help to contract the ureters, and it can supply the even parts of the stomach here to increase motility and secretions. It can supply the duodenum to increase motility, secretions, and absorption. And it can affect the large intestine, specifically from the cecum all the way up to the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. Specifically there, it's trying to increase motility. And it can supply the spleen too, okay? Now, to finish her all up, right, to come down here, we have to finish the last part. So the last part here is let's bring down these parasympathetic, these presynaptic fibers here. I had that in red, my red marker. So we're going to come down here, right, and it's going to stimulate these nuclei here within the sacral region of the spinal cord. And if you remember, this was going to be S2, S3, S4. Now, these guys come out, and specifically, they say that it's in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord, but they don't. There are certain books that'll say that the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord doesn't really, isn't plentiful or isn't in a large amount within the sacral region of the spinal cord. But for right now, we're going to say lateral gray horn. Now, these pelvic splanchnic nerves, so these are called your pelvic splanchnic nerves. Remember, don't confuse these with the sacral splanchnic nerves, because sometimes people might think, oh, sacral region of the spinal cord, sacral splanchnic nerves. No, that was for the sympathetic, okay? This is for the parasympathetic. Now, these pelvic splanchnic nerves go and supply anything that the vagus didn't supply. So, for example, it'll come here and supply the gonads, okay? It'll come here and supply the detrusor muscle of the bladder. It'll supply the internal urethral sphincter. It'll come over here and supply the internal anal sphincter. It'll supply the rectum. It'll supply the sigmoid colon and the descending colon. And then lastly, it'll supply the last part, that little distal 1/3 portion of the transverse colon. Now, what are the effects there? It's going to be pretty much very simplistic. It's not going to be hard. If we come over here to the distal half of the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon, what do you think it's going to do? It's going to cause increase in motility. So the overall effect here is going to be the same. I'll write it down here just for the heck of it though. It's going to increase what? The motility here. So it's going to increase in these 3 points here, the sigmoid colon, the distal half of the transverse colon, and the descending colon. It's going to increase motility, specifically through peristalsis and different types of segmentation and haustral contractions. There's all different types of mechanisms here. Okay, now, next part. It comes over here to the rectum, and it can actually cause the expulsive contractions there within the rectum to try to blow the poop out, right? But right here, there's a piece of muscle, right? There's some smooth muscle right here around the anal canal. And this smooth muscle right here is called the internal anal sphincter. So what is this sucker here called? It's called the internal anal sphincter. Now, when you're in the parasympathetic mode, you can go ahead and blast out a long one if you want to, if you need to, right? Because you're resting. So what is it going to do? It's going to act here on the internal anal sphincter. Now, if you're relaxed, you're ready to go, it can actually cause this guy to get stimulated. If he stimulates, what does he do? So this will relax. And if it relaxes, remember, this isn't the only thing. You also have your somatic nervous system, which innervates the external anal sphincter. And if the somatic nervous system innervates the external anal sphincter and it's appropriate and you have conscious awareness that, hey, this is okay to drop a log here, then you can go ahead and do it, right? But again, it should have internal anal sphincter. It will relax, which will allow for the feces to move forward. But again, don't forget the somatic nervous system has voluntary control over the external anal sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. This one here is involuntary. Okay. All right. Now, next part. We come over here to the bladder. So the bladder, again, it's the resting, the digesting, the defecating, the urinating phase, right? So what are you going to want to do here? You're going to want to cause the actual bladder to contract. So it's going to stimulate bladder contractions. So it's going to try to stimulate the bladder contraction, specifically by acting on the detrusor muscle. And so it'll act on different types of receptors here, like muscarinic, like specifically type 3 receptors, and cause those suckers to contract. What else? It also can act on to the internal urethral sphincter. So here, it'll act on this sucker here, and this is called the internal urethral sphincter. The internal urethral sphincter, when the acetylcholine is actually released here, it'll stimulate this guy. What do you think he'll do? He'll also relax. So as a result here, this guy will relax and help you to let the urine out. So it's going to cause bladder contractions, internal urethral sphincter relaxation. Again, the somatic nervous system has control over another muscle, right where the urogenital diaphragm is. It's actually going to be called the external urethral sphincter. So you do have voluntary control of when you think it's appropriate to pee. But this guy will relax this when again, and it's involuntary. Okay. Last part for the gonads. So for the male reproductive system, it's mainly, remember, parasympathetic point. So what do you think it's going to be for? Engorging the penis, right? So it's going to help with erection. All right, so it's going to cause, it works through a mechanism. Generally, parasympathetic nervous system doesn't affect your blood vessels directly. It can do it indirectly. It releases acetylcholine onto endothelial cells, which can help to produce what's called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide can dilate blood vessels in the actual corpora cavernosum, the erectile tissue, and dilate those blood vessels and increase the blood flow to engorge the actual penis with blood, right, to maintain the erection. So for that purpose, it's going to try to cause the erection. Now, for the female, it's the homologous tissue. There's a structure called the clitoris, right? It's going to increase the blood flow to the clitoris. So what do you think it's going to do there? It's going to cause clitoris engorgement. So it's going to increase the actual blood flow to the clitoris, and by doing that, it's going to affect the erectile tissue within the clitoris. Yes, they do have erectile tissue also. It'll actually dilate the blood vessels via nitric oxide release, increase the blood flow to the clitoris, which will help it to actually become more gorged, right? Okay, so we covered a lot of stuff here, okay? So again, just remember the pelvic splanchnic nerves are from S2, S3, S4. And I didn't mention it here like I did all the other plexus, but there is a plexus here that it goes to. They call it the hypogastric plexus, if you want to remember that. Specifically the inferior hypogastric plexus. Okay. All right, so Ninja Nerds, we covered so much information. I hope you guys really did enjoy this video. I hope you learned a lot. I hope it made sense. If you guys did like the video, please hit the like button. Comment down in the comment section. Please subscribe, guys. Well, once again, we have an Instagram, Facebook, and a Patreon account. If you guys could donate to us, even if it's just $1, it would mean the difference in us being able to make the most high-quality videos for you guys. All right, Ninja Nerds, as always, until next time.